Every tone you'll ever need for shading, you can find in a simple sphere. In this video, I'll show you where these tonal groups exist, how good artists use them for their lighting and shading, and how you can apply it to your work today. Now, when building your understanding, I highly recommend first working with a single, direct light source. As I move this light source around, two other things are moving along with it: the light family and the shadow family. The dotted red line there is the distinct separation between the two. The location of that separation is the first decision you have to make, and along with it comes the first hurdle of confusion. Namely, which tone or value do you start with? Objects in real life have tons of variety after all. Well, the answer here is pretty simple. You average it to one value per family. So I'll set up my light and start a little painting here. I'm starting with two values. This is the average light, which of course looks flat by itself. But right away I'm determining where that separation of the light family and the shadow family lies. And once I have it, I'll fill the shadow family in with average shadow. Now the cast shadow is included in that shadow family, so I'll fill it in too. And we end up with this. Simple enough so far, right? Okay, here's a painting I really like. Obviously, this is more complex than a sphere, but watch what's revealed when I dial in some brightness contrast. We start seeing that light and shadow family pretty clearly. Now, to fully reveal it, I have to reverse engineer this with a bit of paint over, but look what we've got under the hood here. Simple shapes of either average light or average shadow. Now here I've used literal black and white, but you don't have to do that. I could bring the values in like this, and it still works just fine. What matters at this stage is that there's enough contrast for the distinction to be obvious. And a quick reminder, this is a cast shadow from the nose onto the cheek. But as we've already seen with the sphere, cast shadows and form shadows should just be grouped together, as though there's no difference at all. Which, by the way, is largely true in real life. Here I'll use my hand to cast a shadow over the ball, and we see that the cast shadow and the form shadow have melted together. So here's another painting I like. Very different style, but the same fundamental principles apply. Playing around with brightness contrast, a little paint over, and we arrive at an equally clear light and shadow family distinction. Now, one real big difficulty hurdle exists here. The shapes must be simple. You can tell a shape is simple by how easy it is to draw. Think big curves, straights, C curves, S curves. You should be able to fill the shapes in at this stage with like a fat marker. Here's yet another piece I really like. Now, unlike with a painterly piece, here Sean Galloway has arrived at very simple light and shadow shapes, given them one value each, and he's done. I don't even have to simplify this, but here we go. Very simple to draw, graphic light and shadow shapes. Now, whenever you have a darker local value, like his costume is darker than his flesh, it's the same idea, except now each of those things get their own average light and average shadow value. But notice when I eliminate that, the shapes are continuous and simple. Speaking of light and shadow shapes, we are on our way with this one, but I want to make it look more rendered, like this. The next tone or value we need to look at is called halftone. Halftones are critical if you're interested in rendering. They take form and turn it, making your stuff look three-dimensional. Halftones exist in the light family. They occur where the form is turning away from the light, just not far enough to be in shadow yet. You can see halftones on this ball right now. It's this little strip right in here. So if this was our average light value, halftone needs to be slightly darker to turn the form. This value looks out of place, but if I slide it down here, which is still in the light family, we can see that it fits. So that's our halftone, just slightly darker than the average light. The term halftone is unfortunate because halftones are not halfway to shadow. They are much closer to the average light. Just remember that halftones exist in the light family, therefore they should be kept together as a unit, like siblings or something. So here's the halftone on our sphere. Again, very simple shape. It may not look like much because a sphere is so simple, but if I zoom out, we can really get a sense of that form starting to happen. And this is a special moment in a painting. We can now march ahead with yet another principle called edges, which is also commonly referred to as blending. Now, I'm keeping the technique very simple here. I'm basically using the smudge tool and an airbrush to create softer edges. I'm blending both the halftone into the average light and the average shadow into the halftone. This is an area fraught with danger. Because I'm blending the shadow family into the light family, big problems can happen if you lose track of your shapes. And losing track of your simple shapes, trust me, is the most common problem when blending. So there we go, the form is looking quite clear. Let's apply that now to the head. I'll start where I left off. First, I'll adjust the values away from pure black and white. And now I'll put in all the halftones working right into that average light value. The more complex form makes this more difficult than the sphere was, but it's the exact same principle. You are evaluating where that form is turning away from the light, just not turned far enough to be in shadow yet. So just to zoom in on one part here, the light is coming from this direction, and the cheekbone here is just rolling over before becoming shadow. That rolling over part is halftone. Typically, you will find halftones butted right up against shadow, because halftones are often the passage between the light family and the shadow family. Now, I put those halftones in with hard edges, which I did for demonstration purposes. Real halftones, however, quite often come with softer edges. So, just like with the sphere, I'm now adjusting the halftone edges. And while I'm here, I may as well also adjust the edges of the shadow family. I prefer the term edges to blending, because edges reminds me that it's a different thing we're looking at here. The shapes are locked in. The edge is the quality of the edges of those shapes. Are they soft? Are they hard? Are they firm? And that can be dictated by the quality of the form. You know, does it turn sharply or more gradually? This video is brought to you by Skillshare. If you're like me, you watch lots and lots of YouTube videos surrounding your interests. Eventually though, you'll probably want a deeper dive into those topics, and that's where Skillshare has you covered. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creative types. Whether you want to learn how to launch a creative business, or just learn the nuts and bolts of animation, photography, visual effects, creative writing, or film and video, Skillshare is a great way to level up your career, your hobby, or your side hustle. Classes are thoroughly documented and reviewed. You can join forums to interact with other learners, download resources from the instructors, and reflect on your progress along the way. I'm interested in learning from this class about Adobe After Effects. I use After Effects to make these videos, and there's always more to learn about it. So, want to continue your learning? Skillshare is giving the first 1,000 people to use my link a 1-month free trial. That's a lot of classes you can watch. So sign up today and learn something new on Skillshare. All right, back to the lesson. We're gonna tackle 2 new values at once, with the theme being ambient light. Ambient light is all the indirect light that finds its way onto the ball. Most notably in this case, it's the light coming from that lamp, bouncing off this cloth and back up into the shadows of the ball. Now, I put that cloth there to prevent as much bounce light as possible. I did that to help show you the clear contrast between light and shadow families. But watch what happens when I remove the cloth. The bottom of the form shadow is now getting illuminated by the lamplight bouncing off the wooden surface. This is another one of those difficulty hurdles. The bounce light is visible to us in the shadow family, not in the light family. You've got to keep that reflected light value darker than the halftone. If you get this value relationship wrong, it won't look like light. And that's maybe the most common shading mistake that there is. All right, remember how I said we're looking at 2 new values? Well, that second value occurs when we have a lack of ambient light. So here's the shadow family of the ball, but look what happens when that form turns way under and meets the table. I'll get a bit closer here so we can really see it. Right under there. See how it's much darker, almost black? That's because the ambient light, the indirect light, has a hard time getting in that deep crevice. That value is called ambient occlusion. Okay, but let's start by applying the bounced light. Much like halftones, bounce light almost always comes with soft edges, and that's due to the diffuse nature of the light. The light rays from ambient light, which includes bounced light, are not uniform in their direction, so it has a very soft effect. Here I'm putting in some ambient light on the cast shadow. This light may be coming in from a window or bouncing down off the ceiling, but notice I'm leaving the ambient occlusion area dark. So in a way, my painting process mimics how real light works. In real life, ambient light will lighten a dark shadow. So if you start with dark shadows, you can then work your ambient light value into them. And this is how you start getting that rendered result. As I now continue this head study here, notice how much luminosity gets added at this stage. So here I'm lightening the bounce light slightly, but I'm also darkening the ambient occlusion, making sure to keep everything in the shadow family. I want to reiterate, you can really only get here if you've set up your painting properly. I can't tell you the number of student paintings I've seen where the light family and shadow family are not delineated properly, or the values between the two are already too close, or there are just too many values to start with. Here's a nice stylized piece, but we're not going to let style overshadow the fundamentals. The reflected light is designed to come in this way, from the side and a little from above. Similar actually to how the ball looked before I moved the cloth. So let's filter out the style here, leaving the values underneath. And on this simplified version, you can see the clear structure to the reflected light. Those values, though, still all have to feel like shadow. Remember, they're siblings. They're connected. Okay, so let's now paint something using all these values we've learned about. As you can see, it's totally possible to draw with value. Right now, I'm only thinking the first two values: average light, average shadow, making sure there's enough contrast between those two values, because I'll be building in my halftones and reflected light later. What's fun about working this way is everything feels very non-committal here. I can change a shadow shape with a single brush stroke and get kind of instant feedback as to how the lighting looks. Now, you do need to know a little bit about how light falls on the human head, which involves study, of course. And for that, you can use handy little reference sheets like this one, which will give you various light and shadow shapes you can commonly find on the human head. You can find a link to that file in the video description, by the way. So watch right here. I feel like playing around with a dramatic cast shadow or something. See how easy that is to add at this stage with only two values? I'll typically stay in this stage until I feel like the design is good enough to continue. And here I'm doing just that, just darkening my average light a little bit, and from there I will now add halftones. Now I'm trying to do this from imagination, which is something you can do after you've gained a certain amount of experience. But if you don't know where the halftones go, by all means use reference. I don't recommend just guessing at halftone, because if you get the halftones wrong, you can really distort the form. Alright, so now I'm putting in some ambient occlusion. Remember, that's those deeper crevices where the reflected light can't really get to. In this case, that's how I'm rendering the eyes. As you can see, the eyes are completely in shadow. So ambient occlusion is a great value to show something like the thickness of the eyelids. Eyelids are substantial enough to block the reflected light. They create little crevices, and that's how I'm indicating them. Also notice the whites of the eyes. They are in shadow, so they are far from white. I mean, we just painted a white ball, and we saw how dark it got in shadow. Eyes are very much the same. So for the whites of the eyes here, I'm using the ambient light value. And by the way, ambient light is kind of an umbrella term that includes bounced light, and bounced light is also called reflected light. I know, that's confusing. Don't blame me though, I didn't come up with these terms. Anyway, speaking of bounced light, there's a big patch of that on her jaw. I'm imagining light bouncing up from her wardrobe to be responsible for that. And notice how that reflected light fades away near the hair, quickly passing through average shadow and going into ambient occlusion, as the hair blocks the reflected light. Keeping your values close, in a family, like siblings, helps you transition between them seamlessly. And this is also where you consider the edge between values. Sometimes your edge decision will be technical, just based on what the form is doing. But other times it can be based on aesthetics. I do have other lessons that go deeper into edges. This lesson is way more focused on the values or tones, which I do think is a prerequisite for edges. Okay, there's one more little value I'm using here that I haven't talked about yet. Highlights. In my opinion, highlights are overrated, in the sense that they don't contribute to the form nearly as much as they get credit for. Here are the highlights I've used in this painting. A highlight is a reflection of the light source. Take the highlight on the cheekbone, for example. If we imagine a ray shooting out of our eyes, the angle of the form there would reflect that ray up into the light. So you give it a highlight. Don't get me wrong, highlights are great. In fact, I have a deeper dive into highlights on my channel. My suggestion, though, is leave highlights to the end. Make the form work without them, and then the addition of highlights will really bring your painting home. When I was first exposed to this lesson, it revolutionized my work. Every painting I do today as a professional, in any style, has this structure as its backbone. And I really hope it helps you with your work. So, that's all for now. I'm always making new lessons. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.